Hello and welcome to what is arguably my first real video on YouTube. I've done some reels in the past, I've done some advertising, but I really wanted to get into some long form content. I'm a consumer of long form content myself. I like podcasts, and I really like it when people get into the details of what it is I'm interested in. So if you are into string tension, this is going to be the video for you. We're going to dive deep. We're going to talk about every aspect of string tension that I can possibly think of. I have my notes up here, so hopefully I can stay on track and try to cover everything in like under 30 minutes. But whether you're a beginner or a pro, if you've ever had any questions about string tension, as far as, what gauges do I get for this new guitar, or for this scale length, or this tuning, or, if you've just ever felt lost and like maybe you were wasting money trying to experiment, or you're just taking whatever pack of strings is at your guitar center and you're just running with that. If you've ever wanted to learn more about this is going to be the video for you. You may find some of this information in other places. I know I've learned a lot from others. I really want to compile everything together and try to make this a one-stop shop for all things related to strings. Ultimately, I'm an audio engineer. I do remote mixing and mastering, and I just want to share the knowledge that I have anywhere that it's relevant so that I can continue to mix records. It helps me get my brand out there. It helps me show people that you can trust me with your music. And, ideally, if you know more about string tension, you can connect more with your instrument, you can get better takes, and that's what I'm all about. I love to share knowledge. I love to answer questions, and anybody who's interacted with me knows that my Facebook Messenger is open. So if you like this video, if you find any of the content interesting and you want to chat for a little bit, just find me on Facebook, shoot me a message, and I'll give you whatever time I have depending on the day. So before I continue to ramble, let's kind of jump into this. I want to give you a little bit of backstory first. Around 2012, that's when I started playing guitar. So it's been about 13 years, and back even from the beginning when I was starting to play guitar, I knew I wanted to play heavy metal. I knew I wanted to play gent, progressive metal, metalcore, that kind of thing. And like a lot of metal guys who start on guitar, you get a 6-string and you start putting heavier gauge strings on your guitar, and before you know it, you're putting a 7-string pack. You're ditching the high E and you're putting a 7-string pack on your 6-string. And then you get a 7-string and you start putting 8-string packs on your 7-string. And I did that all the way up until I had a 10-string guitar. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what works for me and how to determine what will work well for other people. Back then we didn't really have tension calculators. So I, kind of being more mathematically inclined than most, I just looked up the formula for string tension, which is this. Now, like I said, back in 2012, we didn't have online tension calculators, but I knew how Excel worked. So I created this big chart with, string gauges on the x-axis and pitch on the y-axis, or I think it was the other way around. Anyway, I kind of established what my personal bounds were for tension. So I would go, okay, it's a 100 gauge string and I'm tuned to this note. Here's the range of possibilities, right? If I could go as high as this gauge or as low as this gauge and the guitar will be playable. I was kind of making my own tension calculator in Excel. And it very quickly became apparent that as far as the usable range of a string, it's got to be somewhere between like 10 to 25 pounds on guitar. For bass, it's kind of more like 30 to 45. Bass usually has about twice as much tension per string as guitar does. And, that narrows things down a little bit, but anywhere from 10 to 25 pounds, there's a lot of gauge selection there. So what I want to talk about is the nuance in that range of string tension, right? That 10 to 25 pounds. Everybody has preferences, and there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to go about picking the right strings. But there are some tried and true methods that we're going to talk about towards the end of the video, as far as how to stop wasting money, how to figure out what works best for you so that you can buy the right pack of strings every single time, even if it's for a guitar that you just got. So let's first talk about that equation from earlier. You don't have to be a mathematician to understand how this works. And, we're not going to dive into the formula entirely. We're not going to like solve the formula and do a bunch of math stuff. We're guitar and bass players. We just want to make this work for us and understand the nuances of tension and how the different variables affect each other so that we can make informed decisions. Luckily, we have access to online tension calculators that are basically just doing this work for us. I just want you to understand how a tension calculator works and how to make it work for you. And I think kind of running through this, even just at face value, is going to dispel a lot of myths about string tension and is going to clear up a lot of confusion that you may have. So obviously, tension is how tight the string is. And ultimately, this is what we need to know before we can buy a pack of strings. Unit weight being the mass, most string manufacturers don't provide this information on their strings. Now, back in 2012, I was referencing unit weights from Labella and Diodario. So I believe that they do provide that information. And Callium, which is what I use now, they have their own tension calculator with those units built in. But we'll kind of dive into the nuance of unit weight a little bit later in the video. The scale length is the length of the string from the saddle to the nut. And, for most guitars, 6 strings, it's like 24 3/4 or 25.5 inch. When you get into like drop tuning and you get into like baritone guitars like this, anywhere upwards of like 30 inches for a scale length. And bass can go up to as much as 40. So you need to know the scale length of the instrument that you're looking to get strings for. And then finally pitch, which is just what we're tuning the open string to. Now what's important to realize here is that these 3 variables, right, unit weight, scale length, and pitch, if any of those variables increase, so does tension. And if any of those variables decrease, so does tension. And if you were to increase one variable but decrease the other by a proportional amount, tension should be unchanged, right? So you could, for example, have a longer scale length, increase the scale length, but you could use a lighter mass string, which translates to a lighter gauge. And as long as that change is proportional, your tension shouldn't change. But really what we want to do, right, is we want to talk about how strings relate to playing guitar and bass, especially in a metal context. Since we all like to tune down, we like to play lower. For a lot of people, you're just used to having a floppy low string. Or if you're tuning the entire guitar down, then all of your strings are just loose. So maybe you like that. Maybe that works for your playing style, but maybe you're like me and like a lot of other people who are like, man, I want to tune lower, but I want to have the tension that I had before I detuned all my strings. I want to find that optimum balance, right? This equation tells you that there's an interaction between these 3 variables, right? Simply using a larger string is not going to put more tension on your neck, right? It depends on what you're tuned to. It depends on your scale length. So that's kind of one of the main myths that I wanted to dispel with this video, because I posted a picture a couple of weeks back of a 266 gauge string that I bought for my Quake bass. And I kind of put the string in front of my P bass, which kind of looked ridiculous. And I had a lot of crazy comments of people who are like, oh, you're going to warp the neck. That's too much tension for a P bass, etc. Now, granted, I'm not putting a 266 on a P bass, but I could, right? I could file down the nut and all that stuff and make it work. But the idea is that if I tune the string lower to compensate for the string being bigger, it's not any more tension than a standard 100 gauge or 120 gauge string on a bass. So, as long as you compensate and there's a balance of those variables, you can tune an instrument to anything that you want to within the bounds of usable string tension. You're not stuck playing in standard or a drop tuning or any kind of traditional tuning at all. But once you understand how string tension works, you can tune to anything that you want. It's actually very freeing to know that, hey, I can tune to this weird abstract tuning that no one's ever heard of, and I can buy a pack of strings and put them on the guitar with zero experimentation and know that that pack of strings is going to work. So that's kind of the glory of understanding this. Now, as we've already discussed, these three variables, scale length, unit weight, and pitch, all interact with each other in what I would think is a fairly intuitive way. But I think it's worth diving in a little bit deeper and explaining how these variables work. Also, I just want to take a minute to thank you again for watching this video. If you find what I've been talking about so far to be interesting, please like, subscribe, drop a comment, ask me a question. Let me know what kind of stuff you want to see. You know, the space of content creation for audio engineering is highly saturated. Everything's been talked about 100 different times by 100 different people, and I really want to use my knowledge to explore areas that you still have questions on. I don't want to rehash the same old stuff over and over and over again, right? So if there's anything in particular that would interest you, whether it's related to this topic or not, please let me know, and I'll try to explore it in any way that I can, that I feel that I have knowledge on. And the second thing, really quick, is that I'm an audio engineer. I do mixing and mastering, and so part of the reason why I'm making this video and other videos in the future is to make more people aware of who I am, and to help you feel like you can trust me with your music, right? So it's kind of a social proof in a way. You know, I come from a town that has 3 stoplights. I live in Edwardsburg, Michigan, which is just a very small town. And so if I want to be successful at this and I want to escape the day job, I need to reach out to people who don't know me in my personal life. So if you like this content, if you want to see more, please let me know. I would be happy to continue doing this. So firstly, unit weight. I said we would get to that, right? It's not string gauge. Now, I've kind of been using the two terms interchangeably, and it's because depending on how we're talking about it, they can be interchanged. But if you take a look at a tension calculator and you pull up Callium strings versus D'Addario strings, for example, and I'll put this on screen so you have a visual. If you take like a 49 gauge from Callium and a 49 gauge from D'Addario, you'll notice that in the same tuning and the same scale length, the Callium string has more tension. And they're both 49 gauge strings, but string gauge is a measurement of diameter, right? It's how thick the string is. Whereas unit weight is how much the string weighs. It's how much mass the string has. And so you could infer that the Callium string is made of a denser alloy or a denser steel or nickel or whatever combination it is. And therefore, even though the string is the same diameter, it's the same gauge, it's heavier and therefore has more tension at the same pitch, at the same scale length. And this is actually kind of nice because if you like to tune down, Callium's a great option because their similarly gauged string to the competition generally will have more tension, which will allow you to use a lighter string. So shout out to Callium for making awesome strings. The next thing is scale length. And like I said before, all else being the same, a longer scale gives you more tension, which feels like wizardry to me because I don't necessarily understand why that's the case. But it is the truth, right? A shorter scale is less tension and a longer scale is more tension. Now, compared to the other two variables, scale length is pretty subtle, right? Like you can go up an entire inch on scale length and it will make a similar difference compared to like tuning up or down a note. So it doesn't change a whole lot, but in the grand scheme of things, a longer scale length is going to make tuning lower easier because now you can use a lighter gauge string and maintain more of a guitar sound and less of a bass sound. But this also applies to bass too, right? It's why ding walls are so popular. It's why a lot of longer scale instruments like the Quake bass are awesome because you can either use lighter gauge strings than you're used to, which gives you better playability, or you can tune lower than you ever could on like a standard 34-inch bass. Now, kind of unrelated to tension, there is a downside to having an increased scale length that I kind of want to touch on, right? The frets get further apart. It can make certain types of phrases certain types of like riffing more difficult, sometimes even impossible. You know, if you struggle to span like 4 or 5 frets on a normal fretboard, going from a 25.5 inch scale to like a 28 or a 30 inch scale, you're not going to be able to make those spreads anymore. So this is one of the reasons why multi-scale instruments have gotten so popular over the last like 5 years or so, is because you can have that long scale on the bass side of the guitar or the bass, right? And you can either have a lighter gauge, or you can not change the gauge at all and tune lower than you could before. But now your high strings are just as accessible as they were before, right? You have that short scale length on the high strings, which makes it easier to be more expressive, to do string bends and that kind of thing, because there's less tension. So I just thought that that was worth mentioning. Now, lastly, on scale length, something that I want to touch on is kind of the physics of a string, which I find super fascinating, whether we're talking about music or not. The way that a string oscillates is interesting, and the length of a string pretty much can't be changed on a guitar or bass, right? Unless you're like changing the neck out for something that's longer. The length of the string is determined by the distance from the nut to the bridge saddle. And if you continue to increase your string gauge, eventually you'll reach a point where that string is now less of a string and more of a bar. It gets stiff and kind of just doesn't behave like a string anymore. And that's basically because it'll stop oscillating properly. It'll have decreased flexibility, and this just leads to a string that sounds dull. And it can lead to bad intonation issues higher up on the neck as well. So that's another reason why longer scale lengths are beneficial, because now, let's say, for example, you're using a 170 on a 35-inch scale bass. If you go to a 40-inch bass, that extra 3 inches not only gives you more tension, but it also brings that bar-like string back to being more like a string. And it will, the way that it feels when you pick it and the way that that string behaves while you're playing will be more in line with what it should be. Now, the last main variable here is pitch, and standard 6-string players are typically tuned to E, which is E2, specifically E2 standard, right? And the standard is just referencing the standard way that we tune a guitar in perfect fourths. And when I say perfect fourths, it just means 5 tones apart, 5 frets apart, except for that pesky 3rd string. But the point being is that guitar is hard, right? And guitars can be tuned to anything. It's entirely up to you, like I mentioned before. You're not stuck tuning to standard or drop tuning or an open tuning. You can tune any string to basically anything that you want, as long as you get the right pack of strings. Now, there's a couple of like smaller aspects to string tension that I just want to touch on briefly. And this kind of falls into the area of what I and others call perceived tension. These are things that generally don't get talked about a whole lot, like string break angle at the nut and at the saddle. How at the top of the guitar here, there's an angle that the string goes over the nut, and there's an angle that the string goes over the bridge, and it does have an effect on how the string feels to play. There's also things like string material, what it's made out of, what alloys, whether it's just steel and nickel, or copper, phosphor bronze strings. They all react differently. And then there's also string construction methods, right? So whether it's a circular core string like normal, or a hex core string, there's all kinds of different string constructions. There's flats. Especially when you get into bass territory, there's lots of different construction methods that all have an effect on how tight that string feels. And that's really what this section is about, is string tension isn't just a number, right? It's how the guitar or bass feels in your hands while you're playing it. And sometimes that's hard to quantify. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of those concepts. We're not going to go super deep into the weeds on perceived tension. I could do an entire episode on that. So if that's interesting to you, let me know. So firstly, we have planes versus wounds. Plain strings just feel stiffer, even if it's the same amount of tension on a high E string as your low E string. The high E string will feel tighter. And so for this reason, I always tell people, make your plain strings 2 to 3 pounds lighter than the rest of the set. And kind of on that same topic, talking about planes versus wounds, is the windings themselves. Now, I don't know the specifics. I think every brand kind of has their own approach to this, but adding a winding to a string makes it more flexible. And it kind of gives it a rounder sound, but due to the constraints of a string, the core can only be so big, and the winding outside of that core can only be so big. There's a reason why most string companies stop making planes up to about a 20 or a 21, and it's because the string just becomes so inflexible that it's just not very useful or musical sounding. So around a 20-ish, we start adding a winding to the outside of that string. And then again, you'll reach a constraint again where you'll have to add another winding. And again, you'll have to add another winding. So there are these points at string manufacturing where you reach a certain gauge and there's an extra winding, and you probably don't notice, but you could notice, where the string is tapered. I've definitely noticed most companies right around a 90 gauge on guitar is where they'll add another winding. And so if you have a string set with a 90 as the biggest string, it's going to be the dullest string, and probably pretty noticeably so. And so this is why we try to get away with using the lightest gauge string as possible, because we want that uniform sound across the fretboard typically. I really wish I knew more about this aspect of tension that we're referring to as perceived tension, because again, I think it plays the smallest role compared to the other variables in the equation. But just looking at that equation, you can tell that when it comes to the real world application of playing guitar and bass, that's not all there is to it, right? Every guitar and every bass is a little bit different, and these small changes do have an effect on how good or bad the instrument feels to play. What is the string made out of? Some materials could be more elastic than others. How is the string held in place, right? Because the string length is determined by the distance from the nut to the saddle, but the string has to be held in place somehow, usually tuners and either a string through or some kind of top-loading bridge on bass, right? But those things have an effect on how that string moves. And so it would be interesting to see if there's any kind of science on that. If anybody knows anything about this, and like locking nuts, right? Or locking tuners, locking nut, or if the string locks at the bridge saddle, those all have an effect on how the string is going to vibrate. And so if anybody has any good science regarding break angles or string materials, or like how a string moves or feels to play, I would love for you to drop some of that information in the comments. I'd love to pick your brain about that stuff. But I think now that we've covered all of the stuff when it comes to the equation, when it comes to all of the variables that can determine how a guitar feels to play, let's talk about string packs. Now, there are different approaches to tuning a guitar, and I've heard some of this terminology from certain string brands. There's like String Source, Callium are both great examples that offer like balanced tension sets or progressive tension sets. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, because people like me and possibly people like you are picky, right? And I think there are 4 main approaches to tension. And so we're going to talk about those briefly, right? There's traditional, which is like your typical insert big string name brand here. When you go to Guitar Center or you go to your local music store and you go, give me the 10 to 54 pack. Those are what I would consider traditional string sets, because, well, we'll get into that in a second. The next type of string the next type of string pack would be balanced tension, right, where every string is tuned the same. And that's generally where I'm at on guitar, is I like around 15 to 17 pounds of tension, and then 2 or 3 pounds less on my planes. There's progressive tension, which means that the lowest string has more tension, and as you move up to the high strings, you have less and less tension. It gets progressively lighter. And I prefer that on bass. For whatever reason, palm muting on bass, I feel like progressive tension works better for me. But that's not here or there. My fourth one is just what I called the drop tune tension pack, right? It's when you just buy a pack of strings made for E standard and tune it down to drop D, and you have that floppy low string. Some people like that, and depending on how you play guitar and what style of music you play, that could be awesome. But kind of going back to the traditional string sets, this is kind of what got me interested in understanding how string tension worked 13 years ago, because I was buying these store brand packs of strings, and I was plugging them in to the equation in my Excel spreadsheet and realizing that, string 1 has 24 pounds of tension, string 2 has 19, string 3 has 21, and then one string will have 16 pounds of tension and one will have 12, and it just seemed to not make any sense to me. It seemed to me like having some sort of strategy as far as how you put a string set together would make the instrument more enjoyable to play. And that's why I really do love that some of these newer, maybe not even newer string companies, but in recent times we've gotten access to progressive and balanced tension sets, which I think cater to most people. I think most people, especially people who haven't ever tried them before, would be surprised putting a set like that on their guitar for the first time. And I feel like they would think that, man, something has been missing from my guitar playing. You feel so much more connected to your instrument when it just feels fun to play, right? So ultimately, the whole point of this video is to help you figure out what you want from a string set. You can spend less time experimenting, spend less money on strings, and more time playing an instrument that feels awesome in your hands. So if you can identify what type of tension you prefer, what type of string sets you like to use, you can save yourself that time. You can buy custom-made string packs, or you can buy these progressive or balanced string packs from the companies that offer them. And you can play different tunings. You can use different scale lengths. You can have all your guitars set up in a way that you know works for you. Or you can set up different guitars with different types of tension, whether that's because you want to experiment or because you like to have options. Or maybe you have a studio and you want to have a couple of different instruments set up for different players who walk in that want to use your instruments. And again, I really want to stress that there's not really a right or wrong answer here. You want to pick guitar strings that work for you, and you want to set up your instrument in a way that inspires you to play it. So just identifying how much tension you like is going to help you enjoy playing your instrument with fewer headaches. And like I said earlier, from all of my experience from everything from 6 to 10 string guitars over the last decade, I've figured out that I like balanced tension on guitars and that I like progressive tension on bass. And let me see if I'll minimize this, right? You might not be able to see it very well, but up here, I have listed out the tunings and string gauges for every instrument that I own. And when I need a pack of strings, I just go to Calium's website, I type in all of the gauges that I like, and I order that pack of strings, or I order 2 or 3 packs of those strings. There's no guesswork for me anymore, and it's incredibly freeing, and I can spend my time doing things that are just more important to me. Now, conversely, if I wanted to build a string set for a new guitar, let's say I order a new guitar and it's on its way, and I want to have it strung up to whatever tuning I'm using, which is usually C# standard, I can buy the strings ahead of time, have them arrive, when the guitar gets here, put those strings on the guitar, and just play it, and it just works. Even if it's a guitar with a different tuning or a different scale length, I know that I like X amount of tension. So with those two ideas in mind, right, you have A, you experiment and figure out what it is that works for you, or B, you know what you like and you apply it to all of the instruments that you own. We're going to talk about both of those methods because the whole point of this video is to make it easier for you, right? I'm trying to pass on this knowledge to other people and make your life easier. So finding optimal tension. Again, there's two methods in my mind that work really well. When you put new strings on a guitar, if you disregard pitch, right? Put the first low string on that guitar and tune it up until you get to a point where it feels tight enough to play. Riff on that string for a second. You should pretty immediately have some opinions about how the guitar feels, right? Immediately your brain is going to go, this is too loose or this is too tight. Make an adjustment. Riff on it again. Regardless of pitch, right? And once you get to a point where that string feels good to you, write down approximately what pitch you're at, what your scale length is, and go to a tension calculator and figure out how much tension that string has. Run through that process for every string on your instrument and write down your results. You're probably going to be surprised at what you really like, especially if you're used to just dropping whatever standard string pack on your guitar and then just tuning it. Now, actually fairly recently, I used this method on my Quake bass. All my guitars are set up with balanced tension, right around like 15 to 17 pounds. But on bass, I was having trouble getting my palm mutes to be consistent, especially on a multi-scale bass like the Quake, where the angle of palm muting kind of matches the angle of the fretboard, right? I was just finding it kind of awkward to find the sweet spot on different strings for different types of riffs, like in different registers. And I found that if I use progressive tension on a multi-scale bass, which is what I have, it kind of moves that angled palm muting region and kind of makes it straight again. And it makes it less awkward to play. And so I just kind of had that epiphany pretty recently. But you don't know until you know, right? I was just slapping on a balanced set of strings because it worked for me on guitar and it worked for me on my straight scale bass. But I found out that I actually liked the progressive tension better. The other way that we can find the optimal tension for any guitar is we can use the tried and true method, which is you probably have a guitar in your collection that you love more than all the others, that just feels right for whatever reason. Let's just say you have a guitar or bass that plays exceptionally well in regards to tension, and you want your other you want your other guitars to feel similar. Make a note of the scale length of that guitar, your string gauges, your tuning, and punch them into a tension calculator. Write down the tensions that you get back and use that as a reference for ordering strings in the future. Ultimately, what matters here is tension, right? That T variable is what matters. And while playing an instrument is an art and it's very subjective, it can be helpful to find objective ways to talk about how we approach our instrument. And again, I guess that's kind of the whole point of this video, and I hope you found some of this information useful. Well, that's pretty much all I got. I think I've covered as much as I possibly can when it comes to string tension. I know that it could, at a surface level, could seem like kind of a mundane topic, but it really is the starting point for guitar and bass players. And if you can get that right, if you can get that one thing right, it's going to make your instrument more inspiring to play. You're going to write better music. You're going to feel more confident. And that's what I want to do, is I want to instill confidence and creativity in my clients, in musicians, and hopefully you'll want to come to me and show me the cool music that you've created, and we can work together on a future project. So keep your eye on my page. I'm going to be coming out with more videos that are in-depth, that are long form like this. So again, if there's anything that interests you that you'd like me to cover, just let me know.